Good morning. Wait, okay, look. We're going to talk about AI, right? How popular is AI? So this is going to be interactive. We're not going to just sit back, lean back, and listen. We're leaning forward, right? Agreed? Agreed? Cool, okay. So AI, artificial intelligence. It's caught the popular imagination. It has applications and use cases across all of, or almost all of industry verticals, right? So I got a question for you, since we're being interactive again. When do you think, now I'm quoting a Forbes article, of course, but when do you think the first written, documented history of AI was produced? Guess. I'm sorry? 1947. Nope, what's another guess? Okay, I'll tell you what, just to give you a hint, what's a century I'm talking about? 1800s. Okay, we're not close. 14th century, 1308. 1308, there was a Spanish poet, and this guy, Ramon Lull, look him up, he wrote a paper, and his paper had to do with how to use machinery made of paper to actually combine old concepts into new knowledge. Now, I'm going to leave it to you as the audience to figure out what that actually means, because I have no idea. But that was the first recorded history of AI. Now, what's happened since that period of time? A lot, right? So moving up in the present day, in our panel can talk about this, we've had neural networks have come out, right? Neural networks. We've had backpropagation algorithms. We've had graphical processor units, and we've had, what's the big deal that we've had that's really driven machine learning? What is it? Big data, right? Big data, big data. So you think about all those things that have happened. They've driven this rise in machine learning. And that's kind of what's driving all this interest, this applicability of it. So then there's two major areas. So machine learning is in one area. There's this thing called narrow AI, and this thing called what? General AI. Now, if you don't know what those two things are, you might listen to a friend of mine. He's a CS professor. And he says, general AI is what you use to make movies. Narrow AI is what you use to make money. Believe that or not. So what I want to do in this panel, what we've agreed to do, is to talk, because the space of AI is so large, we want to focus on national security and national defense. I'd like to introduce our panel, Dr. Melissa Flagg. So Dr. Flagg, until January or so, was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Research, so-called DASD-R, and I'm sure she can explain to you what that means. We'll have Sriram Chandrasekar, who's the co-head for .72 Ventures for AI investments. We have Bob Griffin, who's the CEO of Ayasdi. And we have Walid Ali, who's the Senior Director for Intel Artificial Intelligence Products Division. Hi. I'll sit over here. So what I'd like to start out with is the government's perspective, because again, we're talking about national security and national defense. And one of the challenges I found when I was in government was a lot of times industry doesn't quite understand what the needs of the government really are, or how they can solve them, what the challenges are. So Melissa, from your position, what is, from a DoD perspective, what is DoD thinking about AI? Why is it important going forward? And what do you think some of the challenges are?
I think if there's an obsession with artificial intelligence right now in the Department of Defense, and I think it's a great group of folks to put some perspective around the details. I think Bob will give some perspective on the different layers of things that artificial intelligence gives us, right? And those are things that at the beginning that we do quite well right now, kind of classification, up to things like reasoning that actually are still very hard. And DoD tries to treat all of artificial intelligence exactly the same way. So we may be using artificial intelligence for some of our challenges around classifying objects where the technology is getting there, but we're trying to have policies and structures and constraints and acquisition strategies for weapon systems that are going to make very difficult decisions, or cyber systems that are going to police themselves, or logistics systems that have to work with the external community and have lots of sort of intersections with external networks. We're trying to treat all of these problems the same way. So one of the things that I think is important to understand from the outside looking in, I think across the whole national security space, especially in the Department of Defense, but I think national security, homeland defense has an almost more difficult challenge because you have more actors that don't have common networks or common hierarchies or common purchasing structures. But one of the biggest challenges is to understand that AI is in some cases still research, and in other cases it's something you can sell us. But you need to be very clear on what you can and cannot deliver, and we need to be very clear that innovation and acquisition are not the same thing. Right? So you wouldn't go to the nation of Singapore and say, do you want roads or do you want healthcare? Which is more important? They're a nation state. They need both. DoD is like a nation state. We need logistics. We need healthcare. We need training. We need our bases to have infrastructure, reliable power systems. We need to be able to interact with the communities where we reside to make sure that our logistics chains are safe, that they can get in and out as we need. And we need lethality and survivability. We need to go out, execute the mission, and we need to be able to get our people back out. We also like to say we take risk, and I would argue that we do take a lot of risk, but we also are accountable to the men and women that we send out to execute a mission. So they can't hope what they're using will work, because we lose lives, and we're accountable to the citizens of this country when people die because, oh, there was a bug, and we were doing it fast, and we'll do an update, and the next guy won't die because it'll work. It doesn't work that way. So DoD has this massive complexity, and it has a very high standard of things working once you go to acquisition. So I would argue that we need to pull apart, when we talk about AI with the community, where we should be partners on prototyping, pushing the edge of the envelope, driving ourselves further down the chain of what we can do, and where you're talking about selling us something, and then we need to know that it will work in our environment, in a harsh environment, where connectivity may not be reliable, and where people's lives are on the line if the data was biased, or the algorithm didn't learn what we thought it did, or. And so I think it's an exciting space, national security, and I actually think government can be a great partner, but we too commonly confuse being partners in pushing the technology forward and wanting to sell to integrate across the whole country, right? And these are not the same thing. And so if we can begin together to pull apart what is research, what is technology, what is prototyping, and where are we acting as a community to come up with new solutions, and where you're trying to sell us something, then I think we'll all be more, we'll all be happier with each other.
So, Sri, how does that fit in with your investment philosophy from a commercial perspective? I mean, is that consistent?
I think so, right? I'm an early stage venture investor, right? So I'm talking to companies that sometimes have 2 people, sometimes they have 30, but either way, they're early. I would say that as crazy as it sounds, the majority of my job is to look for that faint shimmer of snake oil that sits on top of so many companies that say they're doing AI. Sometimes it's like a very thick layer of oil. But I think fundamentally what we're looking for is 3 things, right? The first thing that I think about when I think about investing in a startup that wants to do something that's AI related is, do they have access to a novel and growing data set, right? So you talked about big data being the catalyst for the sort of AI revolution we're in. And if everyone has access to the same data, I think it's very difficult for a business to survive or exist, right? The reality is, one of the interesting things about this last revolution is all the stuff, all the algorithms are actually published, right? There are very few proprietary algorithms out there. The resources people use are open source as well. And so having access to a data set that is novel, that you have access to, other people don't, is a discriminator and allows you to build a business. And So I think about it like if I was a radiologist and I happen to have access to 10,000 x-rays that I had labeled because I'm a doctor, that allows me to bootstrap into building a product that I could sell to physicians and be like, hey, I can help you identify stuff in pictures faster, right? Once I have that contract or I have a customer that's piloting my thing, every new image that I see is another image that my competitor can't. I can build what I call a data moat, right? I have a moat against other competitors that can join and enter that market. And so I care about that. I care about attracting the right people, right? And so I'm sure Bob can talk about this as well, but the reality is one of the interesting things that's happened the last few years, like 5 years ago, the number of people you call AI people was like numbered in the 50, 100, 500 people. Now there's tens of thousands of people who have graduated colleges that have some level of knowledge and can use TensorFlow or use some open source toolkit. But just because you can use a toolkit doesn't mean you actually know what you're doing, right? The research here is just what Melissa mentioned. It's like cutting edge stuff, and there isn't a deep understanding of why it works, when it works. And so just because you got a 94% accuracy result, you don't know, like if you don't have a deep understanding of what it is that you've actually created, I think it's a worrisome thing, right? And I like to see that companies think about that. And they're like, hey, we have the right kind of person that has domain expertise and has the right AI knowledge, right? I think that's part of it. The third thing I would say is you're solving a real problem, right? And you'd think that this would be a real thing, that people would start companies solving real problems, but it turns out they don't, right? I used to work for a firm called InQtel, which is the strategic venture arm of the intelligence community. And so I got to see all kinds of things, and I remember being super excited about all these companies to say, hey, look, we can use satellite imagery, we can count the number of cars in a parking lot. And hedge funds are super interested in this because they can take the number of cars in a parking lot, a retailer, and use that to figure out what the revenue for a company would be, and they can trade on that. And I was like, that's an awesome idea. Like, this is just such a great idea. You can absolutely figure out what the revenue is, like sort of build a model based on that. I work for a hedge fund now. Turns out it's a terrible idea. And it's a terrible idea because you know what's a better proxy for how much revenue a company does? Getting the payment data from like the people who'll sell you, like, what do the receipts look like this month, right? You know, that's a far better angle at trying to calculate what revenue is than counting the cars in a parking lot, right? And so the number of people who solve non-problems is actually a non-negligible amount. So like solving a real problem. And I think you take those three things and sort of combine that with sort of the topic of the day, which is either national security or cybersecurity. And I think that's sort of the trouble for AI companies or AI vendors, right? Is say you're trying to go after a national security problem, how do you get access to a novel data set, right? These are often data sets you can't access. How do you know what the real problems are? You often don't, right? How do you get the right people with the domain expertise? They aren't out here, right? And that's true in sort of the early topic of the day, which is cybersecurity, which is, cybersecurity has, they're unbalanced data sets, right? Like you get people to talk about how we can build some awesome machine learning model to detect some anomaly within a network, and you have 1 million emails that are normal for everyone that's a phishing email. You have, 1 billion packets of data that are normal for the one that started some hack on your network, and so you have not great data. How do you bootstrap into that problem, right? How do you get yourself initially into a company so that you can get more data to build that data moat? All these things I think are worries specifically for national security and cybersecurity.
So Bob, he's kind of set you up, right? So he set you up because he's talking about how do you trust your machine learning in applications, right? What is solving hard problems, right? So how are you thinking about that? You might say what Ayasdi is first.
So for those that aren't familiar with Ayasdi, we build a artificial intelligence platform that really enables the development, deployment, creation of artificial intelligence applications.
The mic's off. No, I don't think it's on.
Oh, it's not on.
You have a.
Do you have?
I don't have anything.
A portable one?
They told me I was on. My green light is on. So.
This problem's above his pay grade.
I'll use a handheld.
Thanks so much.
How's that? Is that better? Okay. So Ayasdi builds a platform that enables the deployment, the creation, the distribution of artificial intelligence applications. And we focus in a couple areas. Specifically, we focus in the financial crimes area around things like anti-money laundering and risk and compliance. We focus in the healthcare areas around things like population risk and clinical variation management. And we do a lot of focus in the public sector, specifically in the IC and the DoD and so forth, in those areas that it lends itself really well to. And we could play in a variety of different areas, but these areas that we just happen to be focused in because we're areas that we think that the technology can very quickly make an impact to that point around real business problems. Right? But getting back to your question, we believe that fundamentally any machine intelligence application has to be able to do 5 things. Right? It's got to be able to do discovery. So discovery from a machine intelligence perspective is to be able to understand about the data itself, be able to do observational understanding in a semi-supervised or unsupervised fashion. And not necessarily with a specific target or explicit target in mind. So liken it to a child learning, right? We don't have to teach the child that that's the floor and that's the ceiling and that's a podium. Through observation, they'll understand that. Now, we may have to, in a semi-supervised fashion, teach them that's a label called floor, and that's a label called ceiling, and that's a label called podium. So it has to be able to do discovery. It also has to be able to do prediction. From the past, we can predict the future. And if you do discovery really well, you can make your predictions much more effective and much more meaningful. The third thing it's got to be able to do, and this is one of the areas that I think is incredibly important, it goes right to the heart of the question, it's got to be able to do justification. And this isn't transparent AI. It's not just what the algorithm did, but why it did what it did. Why do those sensors go off under these conditions? Why is it that when you make this change of a 3% growth in GDP, do you have to have reserves that look like this? Not just specifically from an algorithmic perspective, but the reasons why it does that. And justification becomes incredibly relevant and incredibly important in the DoD space, especially if you're talking about any kind of kinetic action. Mm-hmm. It has to also be able to do, the fourth thing is act. It has to be able to act on what it has discovered and what it has predicted and what it has justified, but it has to be able to take actions. And then lastly, it's got to be episodic. It's got to learn. It's got to be able to learn from events around it so that it can reapply that 5-pillar chain. Right? From what I've learned, I now discover new things. From that discovery, I can now predict new events. From that prediction, I now have to justify why I've taken those actions, and then I have to act upon that. And those are the critical things that, that any machine intelligence application has to do. Now, the reason that we've taken kind of a platform approach to AI rather than taking a traditional, let's build an application focused on X, is because, look, all applications are going to have to become intelligent or they become irrelevant over time, right? And if you try to take an intelligent application developed today to do one specific thing, it doesn't fit all the needs of other things. You have to be able to look at it across your world, across your enterprise. If you can deliver to a client a platform that allows them to, through a series of APIs as examples, or SDKs, or in the particular case of us, we built an application called Envision, which allows us to very rapidly prototype and develop applications so that you can get them very quickly out into the operational side. Kind of think of it as Power Builder, right, for AI. If you can deliver that capability, then you can harness the needs of AI and really make it relevant to the situation at hand versus trying to force fit a particular application that does AI kinds of things into that particular problem you're trying to solve, because it may not be relevant to that problem, or it may not solve the problem as a whole.
So one of the challenges that, that you have, because Sri, you brought up big data. Walid, how are you thinking about, with the new AI products group, how are you thinking about dealing with some of the learning issues around this whole machine learning revolution?
Well, let me start by, well, first I'm acknowledging all the comments that I heard from the... Thank you. You see, if you had an AI algorithm, it would have taken that on its own. And well, let's start by recognizing all the cautiousness that we heard on the panel, it makes a lot of sense. And naturally, for any new disruptive innovation, any inflection point in the technology and industry, there is an associated hype cycle. The complexity actually that comes with AI is, unlike prior hype cycles where you wouldn't be able to accrue a decent return on investment on the product until it reached a specific tipping point, AI is different. You can actually accrue value add. Your value proposition is yet a growing path. So even if your data is incomplete, if you manage it properly, you can target a specific usage case with a specific class of users and being able to deliver a specific value add to that chain. It is really a compounded supply chain. Unlike the radar theory, for example, that was invented 100 years ago, 150 years ago, it needed to reach a specific point of tipping point for the technology to be mature to manufacture a radar to detect an airplane. AI is different. And I think this is the part of the challenge that we're facing. Where should I jump on the wagon? And how can I secure myself and not create products that would result in me failing in delivering to the organization or the men and women that were responsible for their safety and bringing back home and delivering an executable and trustworthy engagement model. And that's what we try to do actually at Intel. So, but definitely not under the same level of stress you guys have. There is an analog here that we should humble ourselves in understanding. It's extremely important to think of this new wave of technology as a compounded path. It will mature in multi occasions. If you draw, again, the nearest analogy to signal prediction and detection, and remember 10, 15 years ago, there were big companies like Nokia and Texas Instruments, and DSP was everywhere. But if you recall by then as well, the video compression was not as mature as it is today. And as such, there was a specific hype. Compound that, take this to order 10. This is where we are with AI. So the way we look at it, and the semiconductor industry in general, and the issue with semiconductor industry, it's a 3 to 5 years investment. Whatever we invest in our factory today, the life cycle for it, it has to accrue that revenue for the coming 5 years because it's extremely expensive. Intel, and that's public record, we spend north of $1 billion annually for changing our fab, depending on the year, sometimes 1.7 bill just to fill the fabs. So understanding what we're going to be building in these fabs and how to fill them up to meet these needs and how we can really, as Shai was saying, not get confused by the cars in the parking lot versus really read the damn receipts and figure out where you are. Database systems, the system is far more compounded this time in this inflection point.
So let me ask you this. Let's pull on that a little bit, right? So you're saying that you're developing some foundational hardware for these platforms and applications. How are you guys talking about this, right? How do you know what the kinds of application that Bob may be building, that Sri might be investing, that may be useful to Melissa? I mean, how is this conversation happening, or is this conversation happening?
Absolutely, it does happen. It is a very simple, actually, exercise in its essence, very complicated to execute it. Because if you look, we're talking now in terms of national security and defense, and this is a very strong industry that has multi-pillars in terms of data ubiquity, data storage, data delivery, networking aspect. We mentioned quality of service delivery in the field when you have almost unsure, it's like non-supervised learning of conditions that you can even predict how it would look like. So in theory, the process is to understand where the gaps of your estimates are, try to hedge against them. But there are also fundamental basics that we know of. There are usage cases that would require real-time or near real-time execution within a specific degree of fidelity, within a specific degree of false positives. How to map all of this into the silicon that we as a silicon producer will be able to produce in the coming 5 to 10 years to kind of absorb all these shocks. And there will be shocks, and we'll be working it with the rest of our ecosystem. That's why it's extremely important to understand the industry of defense, the industry of FSI, the financial services industry, the industry of healthcare. There are similarities, but if you don't understand the differences you end up actually unable to deliver to them.
How's the communication going, Melissa?
Sorry.
I said, how's the communication going?
Well, I mean, I actually think there's a lot of communication. I think the problem is, especially in across national security, the problem space that the problems you're trying to address are so many and so complex. I also think that we have a lot of rules about who can see what kinds of data, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're the intelligence community, you can see the foreign data, but maybe not the US person's data. And if I'm at DoD, I can see some of the data, but I can't see some of the source data from Intel. And then if I'm working on logistics, I need to bring all this external data in, but I don't want that to commingle with the internal data. And then I have vendors who come and sell me a great capability, but they want the data to be only theirs, because that's where they get value. And they want the application, right, to not be able to plug into the 9,000, 90,000 other vendors that I have, right? They don't want to work with a prime. They don't want to work with one of the big 3 or big 10 because they don't want their IP to get stolen, or et cetera. And so it isn't necessarily a lack of communication or even will or desire. It's that the profit motives don't necessarily all align with one another, and they certainly don't all align with the complexity of the policy and sort of data flow realities that we have and the missions that we need to accomplish. And so I think there's actually some policy that could be improved if we had a climate that was more conducive to making bipartisan, complicated, highly technical solutions. I don't necessarily think we should spend a lot of time banging our head against that wall. So I think it's an interesting opportunity for us to perhaps even create red teams. Like, don't wait for the government to come to you and say, let's create, we're going to tell you exactly what the problem is we want you to solve, go solve it. But actually get folks together to begin to think about, okay, we all have our motives, we all have the things that drive us, we all have the things we want out of this, and you have these problems. Let's try to identify new structures, new models, new approaches, new strategies where we can tackle these things that aren't necessarily coming from the top down. I think we have a moment in time where there's space for bottom-up solutions, but we haven't been working that way from a DoD national security perspective. It's been very top-down, very hierarchical, very much we tell you the problem and then you tell me if you can solve it. I think you have to flip that model in AI. Yeah. It moves too fast. It's this combination of research and reality. And I think if you wait for all of that to come from the top down, you're 10 years behind your adversary.
How does that relate to the kind of business models that you guys are thinking about?
I think it relates well, right? I mean, the good news is this, right? So, I mean, sort of the classic business school teaching would be that you don't want to be a business that sells into a cost center, and security is often a cost center in most enterprises. Security is more than a cost center for national defense, right? Like, it's core to the mission, and so that's a huge opportunity. The other thing I would say is that today's sort of machine learning experts, today's young people, they want to work on interesting problems, and I'd argue, and I spent the majority of my life working in the defense and intelligence community, that the most interesting problems are there, right? And people want to work on interesting problems, and they feel like they've accomplished something. I think that we're back to the sort of chicken and the egg problem where fundamentally you can't start working on a problem unless you understand it. Mm-hmm. And if the only signaling that a entrepreneur gets is somebody at very senior levels of government saying, hey, we have got this big problem. We have security video that needs to be analyzed or whatever, right? Like, that's the only insight you have into the problem. That actually is not enough insight to go build a product or build a company, right? It's that real worker level experience and knowledge that you need, and how do you access those people, and so you can actually really understand that problem and know what to build, right? Investors like me, we don't want to invest in services business. People who will go and say you build custom products for each company, right? We want to invest in platform companies like Ayasdi. They're like, hey, look, we can create a solution. You guys can go build your own solution. We'll provide you the tools to do that. Or we want to invest in companies that are like, hey, we've got a product. We can sell you that product because it's a higher margin business. And I think the not understanding the problem is sort of makes that gap a very broad one between the people who have the right technology and expertise to build solutions and the solutions that are needed.
Yeah. So how are you finding your problems? Right? I mean, because what I'm hearing is this issue of what's the problem you want to solve?
Well, I can tell you that, is this working now? It's not me because I, yeah, that's
Yeah,
better.
good
yeah. So maybe it is me. I can tell you that there's no want for problem opportunities, right? It's interesting when you're an AI software manufacturer, you get a lot of inbound calls, and those calls are always around, I need to be doing something in AI. I'm not sure why, but I need to be doing something in AI, and so we spend a lot of time kind of helping through that educational process. I will tell you that from a hardware relationship communications perspective, as a software manufacturer, I wake up every day and I thank God for Moore's Law, because the fact that we're improving hardware every day is making it more effective for us to do things and push that envelope as close to the edge as possible, which is giving us the ability to unlock those new insights that we haven't been able to look at ever before. It's interesting, you know, you talk about being I talk about being a platform provider, and that's ultimately our goal is platform proliferation. You know, it's develop artificial intelligence applications and deploy those across your enterprise, and here's a way to do that. The reality is, and you know this from a business perspective, platforms are inherently hard to sell. Right? And they're hard to sell because you have to sell visions, right? You have to sit down with somebody and say, let me tell you what this can really do for you. And they kind of go, yeah, okay. And if you don't have a relationship there, visions are really hard to sell, right? So we took the approach to say, let's go solve problems. Let's go solve real-world problems and show them demonstrable proof that you can deploy these on a platform like this, and it will show you the effect to your bottom line, as an example. One case of that is, you know, we have a very large banking client of ours that we work with in the UK that has paid more than their fair share of fines around anti-money laundering and so forth. And they came to us and said, look, we've got nearly 7,000 investigators, and we're getting almost 98% false positives in the AML side. What can you do to help? Right? If you can come back and give us, say, 3 to 5% reductions in false positives, that changes our game. So we put ourselves in the middle of their workflow, just before they feed into their Mantis solution, take that data, provide our analytic approach to it, and we're able to effectively reduce not 3 to 5%, but 26% reduction in false positives. Right? That changes the world for them. That changes the game. So the opportunity sets, you know, became relatively self-evident in the areas around financial crimes, right? In the area of healthcare, you know, we developed a program some time ago that we used to internally refer to as kind of Ayasdi good, which is where we will give a development license to researchers and let them tackle their toughest problems. And we looked at working with a client, a researcher, that we looked at 40-year-old data they've been studying for type 2 diabetes. Right? How long have we been studying type 2 diabetes? 40, 50 years? A long time. And through the use of our capability, we were able to very quickly sub-segment that data into 3 subcategories around type 2 diabetes that unlocked incredible insights. If you're in this category, you're likely to develop cancer in this time frame. If you're in this category, you're likely to develop retinopathy or blindness. Those are new insights. They recognize that, wait a minute, these are all symptoms of a greater problem, and we need to change the way we're prosecuting a cure and prosecuting the way we treat this disease. That's 40-year-old data. Now, why are we able to do that? We're able to do that because we've taken and I'm not going to geek out here in a math perspective, but because I can't. We've taken a science approach using a discipline of mathematics called topological data analysis, where we understand and study the shape of data. All data has shape to it, and that shape is relevant, right? And unfortunately, when we were looking at doing analysis on data, most people will take, like, say, a linear regression approach. Well, that's good if the data is linear in fashion. Right? Or maybe we'll take a clustering approach. So that's good if the data clusters up into 3 nice tight clusters, and you can do things. But what do you do when the data is shaped in a flare? Or what do you do when it's shaped in a knot, or it's shaped in its time series? You can't unlock all of the insights because you're using a discipline that will only give you, using traditional methods, a slice into that data versus looking at that data holistically. That's changing the game, and that's what I think is going to really start to advance artificial intelligence in new areas that I don't think we've ever seen before. I think it's going to change the world. It's moving away from traditional problems that artificial intelligence has solved around problems of perception to problems of very complex problems that have not necessarily frequent occurrences, but have a lot of sparsity from a data perspective, or not complete from a data side.
Let me ask you this. I'm going to take this up a little higher because you're talking about the kinds of things you're doing can lead to, just revolutions in artificial intelligence. From all of you, what do you think you can do with machine learning right now, and what do you think you can't do, and what can we do, let's say, 5 years in the future based on the trajectories, right? So I've got a business. What are the kinds of things I can tackle right now, and what are the kinds of things I can't tackle right now?
I think you started hearing hints about it and what Bob is talking about, and what we've heard earlier as well. Even earlier in the conversation, how can I associate a CapEx or an OpEx to solving a problem, even from a national defense perspective, where the value is really binary. I mean, one failure could be catastrophic. So sometimes even the need for understanding that is key. But you heard from Bob, and I'm going to dwell on that example of diabetes and the 40 years studies. Compound that, saying for that physician who has been collecting the data, he's collecting it from his clinic. Good for him. Can you imagine if he's listening to the World Wide Web, for example, the internet, looking at the traffic of associated information about this problem, and he has to come up with a way of filtering the good from the bad, from the ugly. Someone can even be manipulating him to bias his thinking one way or the other. And so far, we're talking only World Wide Web, let alone dark and deep web, where things can be very, very good or very, very bad. My point here is, with AI, before we start thinking of building products, and I couldn't agree with you more, Bob, I think Moore's Law has been a great tool, and it will continue being a great tool. Maybe there might be modifications. Evolution is a feature of our species in general. But understanding the underlying supply chain of where the data is, wealth of data will govern your success to deliver value at the end. Understand where your data is, how to be able to produce it in a meaningful fashion, in a timely fashion, and also in a trustworthy fashion. Trust is key. And anything that goes below the radar of trust, you might be better off without even handling it at all. These are the set of perimeters that you need to start thinking of when you're building your pillars, to start building your products on top of. So to summarize your angle, I'm not really dodging it or anything at all. The notion of how far in the past I should look at my data versus how soon, the shape of the data you heard about talking about, whether it's a flare or a star, or how to manage these multifocal points of interest, that will change also with time. We can go geeky now, start talking long, short-term memory and how to manage ingredients, optimization from one problem to the, but in reality, your underlying hardware platform has to be able to adapt to new patterns of data processing that requires massive compute commitment and then releasing these resources. This is the challenge of the hardware manufacturers, the people like us and our competition, into this new era of hardware.
Thanks.
You make an incredibly important point about the data side, right? It's look, everybody will tell you content is king, and I believe that. But I will tell you, access and distribution to content is King Kong.
Yep.
Okay, that's what's going to really change. You getting access and distribution to it, because once you have that, you can start to do things that are incredibly unique, that can add that value from a real business perspective, at the time of need, at the point of operation,
100%.
and so forth. And let me tell you, when you're talking about, when you're talking about DoD applications in the field, real-time execution, point of need is everything.
Right, you have to be able to respond at the speed of the fight, and that's so much faster than a human brain right now, and it's only going to get faster. I have a question. That makes me very excited about the idea that if you can justify, right, if the AI can justify to me why without telling me what it did, why it did it, then I might be able to give it all the data that's mixed up. The analysts, all these policy separations don't matter anymore. It spits out an answer. It tells me why, but none of the humans had to actually cross these policy boundaries. We might make policy irrelevant if we can move fast enough on the technology before we tell people what we're doing.
We didn't hear that.
I'm not supposed to say that. That's why they got somebody who quit the government.
That's how I get all my traffic tickets, by the way, speeding. I'll go there faster.
I mean, to answer your question more specifically, Reggie, about like what I think is possible, what's not, because like I think that's my day-to-day job when I see people coming in and pitching things is, what's made deep learning so powerful is the ability to analyze unstructured data, right? We've had machine learning techniques to look at structured data for a long time. The things that modern graphics processors and AI processors enable, and what all this huge amount of data enables, analysis of unstructured data. And I had a friend once tell me, and it actually makes a lot of sense to me, that and so you think about unstructured data, it could be unstructured text, it could be images, it could be audio, and the reason why Siri probably works pretty well, or transcription, speech to text works, is because of deep learning. But I had a friend say, and this like really stuck with me, is that a fly with like 1,000 neurons could not run into the wall because it could see, but only human beings can write and read, right? I'm really wary of companies that come in and say, hey, I can do really interesting things with text, or I can really understand the text, or I can summarize this text so it's effective, et cetera. Largely because there's such a tremendous amount of nuance in text, right? I fully believe that that image analysis, video analysis, audio analysis is at a point where, while I wouldn't trust it to run systems by itself, I think there are great opportunities to like have the technology assist human beings in making decisions, right? I am terrified when it's like I'll be fully honest, I'm an AI investor. I wouldn't want someone to send me a summary of here are the companies that are out there and what they do. I'd rather read the articles myself. And I think that's just like largely because that I think AI's made huge progress, but like that's probably the next 5 to 10 years. I'd love to see progress there.
Got it. Yeah.
So, one of the things that we don't talk enough about from an AI perspective is one of the real capabilities and values from an artificial intelligence perspective is the ability to do skills upgrade. That's going to be incredibly important as we move forward, right? The ability to take, for example, a nurse practitioner and upgrade her skills in line with this technology to make her as relevant and as effective as a doctor. Maybe not in all things, but in some things, right? A cyber warrior, we can't train enough cyber experts right now, right? But if we can take a more junior person that's introduced to the cyber realm through his university and college, but doesn't have the practical years of experience, and upskill them with artificial intelligence, it's a game changer. It's a force multiplier. It changes the way we're going to prosecute those opportunity sets and so forth. Skills upgrade is an incredible application for what artificial intelligence can do.
Excellent, thanks. So we're running short on time. What I'd like to do, yeah, exactly. I'd like to open it up to the floor for questions. We got a bunch. Where are the microphones?
Right here.
Oh, right here. Can someone help me here? Hold on. Hang on. For me, I'll sort his hand first. Okay, there you go. Okay, there you go.
Right. Thanks.
Yeah.
So I had a question, but just to give the backdrop, there are sort of 3 points that I come across. First, most vendors will throw in buzzwords like machine learning and AI and convince me and probably you that they've solved the problem, whatever the problem is. Point number 2 is I know colleagues and researchers and so on who have enough data points where they say that machine learning is not ready for prime time yet in the security context. And point number 3 is that there are enough, or at least reasonable number of proof points where I can try and spoof the machine learning algorithm if I know what it's doing, and presumably if I have an intelligent enough machine learning algorithm, then I can figure out what it's doing, right? So given these, what is your perception of sort of the ground reality of machine learning and security? And what do you think needs to be done there?
Great, thanks.
I can start, yeah. I think my mic is on, so I'm good. I do believe when they come and they show you a problem solution, that it does work for that problem solution. So it's your homework to figure out.
data set.
Exactly, on that data set, if it makes sense within the bigger context. So leave the joke aside, in reality, every problem has a domain and has a range that might map to other problems of equal value. For us, again, in the semiconductor industry, unlike the software industry where your capability of changing and rejuvenating or pushing a new update to the product is order of magnitude higher than what I can do with a processor that might be sitting in your computer for the past 15 years. I don't think you heard Intel going and ripping it out and putting it back because there was a bug. So understanding where that spectrum of reality, hope, myth, and where to really target your product or to target your policy or to target your deployment is extremely important. And it is for people like those in the room here who have the expertise and the knowledge of the field, of the space, to be able to make that delineation. You're really writing, I hate to say that, the bird is in your shoulder. You're really writing a new chapter of humanity. But you have to understand where myth from reality lies. So understanding that will position us for success. If you're looking at a specific degree of network traffic, if you multiply that by a couple of other dimensions and ambiguities and distribution channels and other it becomes a completely different paradigm and problem than what started with. So to answer your question, understanding where you are, where would you like to go within the timeline of your investment is extremely important to make the right milestones to invest against them.
Yeah, and I'd say that, like, I think I disagree with the assessment that machine learning is not the right solution for security, and I'd say it for the following reason. Not because I think AI and machine learning is amazing and can fix all problems, but rather because in security, whether it's looking at video camera feeds in a in an operation room, or whether it's cybersecurity and packet speed related data, I actually think that like the places where machine learning has the most impact and can impact the most are where the data is dropping on the floor right now, no one's looking at it, right? The hardest places for AI and machine learning to like make an impact is when you are competing against a human being that's actually doing the job right now. And I'd argue that the vast majority of video isn't looked at, and the vast majority of packet data is not looked at. And as a result, like that's actually a huge opportunity for machine learning. On the question around like, hey, couldn't you design a machine learning system to counter the blind spots of your machine learning system? I think the answer is yes, but I think that's the reality of any sort of like attacker defender scenario, right? Like there's going to be constant churn there as people figure out how your defense works and then try to work around it, and then you build a system that like counters their attack. And I think that's just part of the nature of security.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think AI will play a role, and if we just take security in the sense of cyber, just as an example, right? I think it plays both defensively traditionally, right? I think it becomes a new layer. It replaces the traditional rules-based engine type of environment, and because of the ability for it to adapt and adjust based on episodic events. Each time somebody tries to penetrate, it learns something new. They learn something new, it learns something new, and it starts to look at a predictive form as to where the next incursion is likely to be and so forth. So I think it's going to play a traditional role from a defensive perspective, but I think it's also going to play a new role in an offensive section, right? It's going to be, first of all, it's going to be a hunter. It's going to hunt through your data to see if the bad guys are already there.
Right.
And it's going to be able to subsegment those and start looking at things that are anomalistic that shouldn't happen given your environment, right? It's going to help you build out, I think, that level of intelligence that is just taken for granted at the governmental level, but not at the commercial level, around who attacked, why attacked, where they're likely to attack, and so forth. And I think it's going to play an interesting role in the thing that I worry about the most from that perspective of the Sony CEO that finally gets pissed off and says, I'm sick and tired of North Korea attacking my infrastructure here. I got these really smart guys sitting over here, and I'm going to turn them loose. And I think that's an incredible capability that it's going to unleash. And that's why that policy conversation, that's why those kinds of things are going to be incredibly important. But that's also important as to the whole justification piece, as to what's happened and why it's happened and what are we going to do about that's happened.
Sir. Hang on. You got him? Okay.
I'm trying to understand the reliability of AI systems. And my question is to Ms. Flagg. How close is the DoD to allowing an AI system to make a kill, no-kill decision without human participation?
Okay, I wound up in the news as the killbot lady the last time somebody asked me this question, so I'd rather avoid that. But I don't work for DoD anymore, so who cares, right? I made Maxim magazine, not my aspirational journal. So I think it depends on, so I don't think that's the first place AI is going to be in DoD, right? I don't think the first place that you're going to put an artificial intelligence system is on a warhead. It's not logical, right? What you will have are sort of layers of discriminators like we have now with precision-guided munitions that try to make sure that you don't hit the wrong target, right? The most important part of actually having a system that can make decisions on its own at the end is actually to avoid hitting the wrong thing and having massive collateral damage. We've actually become much more precise at placing a weapon where we want it and minimizing really catastrophic damage to innocent communities because we have smarter weapons. And so for me, this is a false conversation where they're sort of like, you're just gonna have these missiles that run around thinking on their own and just indiscriminately drop on things. That's not happening. It's not happening. Please, the media needs to write down, I said that's not happening. But what I think the opportunity in these kinetic systems for artificial intelligence is actually in the reverse. It's to be much more discriminating as to when you stop the attack. And so I think it will happen because I think our adversaries are going to do this. Our adversaries do not have the same reluctance to place the most competitive sort of automated systems in play right now. They do not have the same sort of reluctance to trust automation, and they don't have the same training and trust of their people, of their men and women in uniform. The US has one of the most highly professional, highly trained, enlisted services of any military on earth, and we trust our people. That's not the case in every nation, and so they do trust automation more. So what the US is going to have to do, and I know I'm over, I'm sorry, I'll stop talking, is to find this justification space with people like these people up here, right? To know when we can trust it and how it works with our people, because that's the advantage we have in national security, is that we will be able to leverage the best AI and the best people. And that's why we need you guys working with us as a community.
Excellent. Listen, we are out of time. I apologize, we're out of time. There is a networking break, and I'm sure we can talk to the panelists then. I want to thank all of you for
Thank you.
sitting panel. Appreciate it.